Okay, hello everyone. This is going to be the second tutorial. We're going to do some selective dodging and burning and color adjustments. So just like before, let's make sure that our files are exported off of our SD card and put onto a folder somewhere on the desktop. Here I just have a little folder for tutorial stuff. And let's just open that image in Photoshop by just dragging it on top. There we go. So now we have our JPEG image loaded into Photoshop. And the first thing I'd like to do is make sure that my background is actually a normal layer. So I can double click on the background and it'll tell me to rename it to layer 0 or something. I'll hit OK. Now you can see that this is layer 0 and not background. The reason I want to do that is so that I can copy and paste it to create a duplicate layer. So if I click on the layer, hit Control or Command C, and then Control or Command V, there we go. It'll let me copy and paste this layer. The main reason I want to do this is because I'm now going to apply a camera raw filter on top. So if you're inside of Photoshop and you already have an image open and you want to edit some raw settings, you can go up to Filter and then Camera Raw Filter. Just click on that. And then it will kind of open up Camera Raw as an extension within Photoshop. So from here, this is just a JPEG, so we don't have a ton that we can do, but I can lower the contrast and the highlights. We can see here that these highlights are getting pretty bright. Next, inside of Camera Raw, I want to show you a great way to get rid of color fringing. Color fringing is this kind of magenta and green cast that can sometimes be seen in your images, especially if you shoot your images wide open with a very wide aperture. You can see a little bit of green here in the background, and you can definitely see some magenta here on these words. So in Camera Raw, you can go to the Optics section, and then right here, there is a defringe. It may look like this, and you might have to click down to open it up. And then from there, we can just slide how much of the purple we want to take away or not. We can also adjust what the exact, section of color that it's going to be affecting. So let's just drag and get rid of a little bit of purple. It doesn't take much. I'm just trying to get rid of any fringing I see here. I also see a little bit of green kind of in the background and on these back edges here. So I'm going to try and get rid of that. Yeah, there we go. We can get rid of the green as well. Now let's hit OK. And that image will now apply that filtering permanently to this layer on top. So this is our original image and this is our Camera Raw filtered image. Just remember that it's not a reversible process. So you can't go back and adjust those Camera Raw settings later. Once you apply the filter, it is applying that filter to the whole image. Next, let's go over the crop tool briefly. So over here on the left, I can click on the crop tool and then I can click on the image. And then when I see the rule of thirds there, I know that I can just drag and crop. Let's straighten it. So if I click somewhere outside the image, you can see it's got that little kind of turn cursor. And I can then straighten it and it will automatically crop into the image the amount that I might need. So let's just try and straighten the little coffee grinder here. I'm going to make sure not to cut off the edge of these cups. So let's just do a little bit, somewhere like right there. All right, next, let's actually crop out a little bit of this corner. We want to make sure when we click that up here in the ratio, which we have some preset options, 5:7, 1:1, and then we have original ratio, which is what I want to click. When I click that, now when I scale, see, even if my cursor goes to the left or the right, it will always keep the original aspect ratio of my image, which is nice. If I then click, if you hold Control, you can freely see it's not snapping. If you hold Control, it generally will get rid of any snapping. See, I don't hold control now and it's kind of snapping around. If I hold control, it just lets me freely move it smoothly. So let's readjust a little bit. There we go. And let's hit OK. I accidentally missed a little portion of my image here. See that? So let me go back to the crop menu. And I can just crop that out. There we go. Okay. So the first thing I want to do to this image is add all of my global adjustments, meaning adjustments that are going to affect the whole frame, the levels, saturation, and color balance adjustments that we did in the last project. So I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layers. Make sure you're always using adjustment layers. And I'm just going to do some quick global edits here. I'm not going to worry about overexposing these highlights here because I'm going to be correcting those in just a little bit. Okay, so I just sped up the footage through there. I just added the regular, levels, beefing up the contrast. I added a little bit of warmth with the color balance there, and I just did a touch of saturation. It doesn't really need much. So the first thing we want to do is do our dodging and burning, which means to make the image selectively brighter or darker in certain areas. There are two basic methods. First would be darkening the highlights, and then the second would be brightening the shadows. So let's darken the highlights first. What we want to do is make sure we select on the bottom layer. We don't want to be on top of our levels color balance. In fact, let's make a group. A group is a way to put different layers into a folder that then, you can keep everything organized. So if I select on my hue saturation, then hold shift and select and click on the very bottom levels, you can see I have highlighted all three of those. If I right click, there is an option. Here, let me make sure it's on screen. There we go. There is an option for group from layers. So I click on that. Now I can rename this. Let's call it global edits. There we go. And now you can see that those three layers have been added to a single folder, which is also handy because then we can turn them on or off anytime we want, which is kind of nice. So now we are ready to try and darken these bright highlight areas. So let's add a levels adjustment layer. And let's make sure it's underneath of our global edits. And here I want to drag the white point, which is below our general 3 sliders that we've been using. The white point and the black point are down here. So if you raise this one, it'll just make the whole black point of the photo more gray. And if you lower this one, it'll make the whole white point of the photo more gray. In this case, let's just lower it a little bit. And I'm kind of looking for when these highlights start to become a little dull. All right, that looks pretty good. It's pretty dark at this point. Okay, next we need to talk about layer masks. So this little white box here next to our histogram little icon is our layer mask for our new levels layer. If you don't see this, let me just delete it. If you don't see a layer mask and you need one, if you look down here, this little square with the black circle in it is the layer mask button. We click on that and it will add a layer mask for us. The way that a layer mask works is anything that is white will allow this layer to pass through and be visible. And if there's anything black on the layer, it will be transparent. So it will not add that effect or that layer into our final image. Over here, we need to make sure we select the brush. I can just make the hardness 100% and we can make it a relatively big shape. And then down here, we have our little color palette. If you don't see black and white, like if it's gray or some other color, click this little button right there, and then it will return us to black and white. I can switch back and forth between white and black just by clicking that little button, or you can press X on the keyboard. So if you just, there you go. You can switch it back and forth just with X. So right now our whole layer is white, meaning that all of this filter and this layer is going to be visible. If I then make sure black is selected and then I click and paint part of the image, you can see that it's erasing that filter in that part of the image. And then you can also see that little drawing that I just made replicated there on the mask. So let's hit Control Z to undo that change. And basically, this is the process of how we're going to be painting and adding filters to our images. Let's select on the mask and then hit Control or Command I, which will invert the whole layer. So we've turned the whole thing black. If I turn the eyedropper on and off, it's not doing anything because the whole layer is essentially invisible. So what we want to do is select white and a brush. Make sure your opacity is way down so that when we add, when we add white back in, it's not just going to be pure white. It's going to be, very subtle, and we can slowly build up our effect. Let's zoom in. We have the brush. Let's make it a little bigger. That's maybe a little too big. It's very hard to adjust. There we go. That'll work. And then I want to reduce the hardness all the way to 0. So now when I click, you can see that it's very subtly darkening the area. If I click here, you see it's really, really subtle, which is what we're going for. So let's just click and paint, just on some of this bright edge down here. Just click and click and drag. Just kind of slowly paint on this darkening effect. And you can see down here on our layer mask, we're slowly making a kind of fuzzy white area that is allowing just the darkening from our levels adjustment to affect the highlights here. We can also get much more precise. If we make our brush much smaller, we can just paint in to those really, really bright highlighted edges a little bit. We don't need to do too much, but let's just lower the brightness on these areas. Let's also come down here to this cup. Let's make this a little bigger. The bigger the brush, the smoother everything kind of looks. So even if it's overlapping the exact bright area, having a bigger brush doesn't hurt at all because it kind of will naturally blend all of your layers through. There we go. These are pretty bright areas, so they take a lot of building up. You can probably hear me clicking away. So a reason why it's very important to have your levels adjustment underneath of your global edits is so that we're actually affecting the image before it gets to this, bright contrast that we were adding. If we were to put it on top, it would just darken the already overexposed part. But you can see in this area in particular, when I paint in, it's actually bringing back the details. It's not just darkening what we have already made really bright. It is going to bring back the actual detail to those areas because we are darkening the image before it's actually getting to our global levels adjustment. And I'm almost done here. Let's make these buttons a little bit darker. Here as well, you can see we are actually darkening like the highlight back down. So now there's actual detail coming back into these highlights. All right, that's looking pretty good. Let's zoom back out and let's see how that looks before and after. So there's no adjustment. It's very, very bright. And there is our highlight fixing adjustment. Now we can go back to our levels layer, our global levels layer at this point, and we can brighten it up a little bit. Maybe now that we've kind of made it darker, we can just readjust to make sure that everything is looking the way that we want it. Next, let's brighten some of these shadows. So let's underneath of, or it could be underneath or on top of the highlight darkening. Let's just label this one darken highlight. There we go. So let's add a fresh levels adjustment layer. There we go. And I could have just renamed this one at that point, but let's just double click on that layer and say Brighten Shadows. There we go. And so here you may think that we do the opposite of what we did for the highlight darkening. and just raise up the black point, but that is actually not a great thing to do. We don't really want to artificially gray the shadows. What we would actually want to do is raise up our midtones. You can see how that's kind of brightening most of the image, including the shadow areas. So let's just raise that up to like 1.5 or so. Next, let's click on our mask to make sure that it is selected and then hit Control I, which will invert that mask for us. And just like before, we're still selected on white. And I'm going to make my brush really big so I can just affect these big areas in the image and make sure the hardness is 0 and also make sure my opacity is around 10%. And then I can just slowly click into these darker areas, like up here on the little bean hopper. Maybe right there. Maybe a little bit down here. It's kind of dark. I'm kind of imagining that this is a some kind of product shot for this grinder. So we can also brighten the little edge of the coffee cup, maybe that little dark area down there. And that looks pretty good to me. There we go. So we can click that on and off. You know, it's pretty broad and wide and smooth, which is what we want. So that looks pretty good from there. Another thing to remember is since these are adjustment layers, we can always go back and, you know, edit this later. Not only can we go back and actually change all of the levels adjustment settings, but we could also change the opacity of the layer as a whole. So if I'm selected on these shadows or on any layer, I can click up here and then just lower the opacity of the whole layer. So say we wanted something in between our full opacity and nothing, we could just select, you know, 80%. And so it would be a little more subtle where we might want it to be. Next, let's do something a little more advanced, which will be adding contrast to a certain area of the image. This is generally something you won't do very much of, but like say you wanted to add contrast just to the bark of a tree or something like that, you could do that. We're not limited to just brightening shadows and darkening highlights here. So let's add a fresh layer. And then I'm going to say add contrast to screen. So here at the screen of this little grinder, you can see it's like kind of dull, right? Like it's not very good looking. So let's just adjust these levels for just that screen. Let's do that. Let's make it way darker. You know, it doesn't have to be super extreme, but let's just like kind of add a little bit of contrast there so that that screen looks, you know, nice and easy to read. Now you can see we've like really affected our whole image here. So let's make sure we invert that mask. Make sure we are selecting white, and let's do like a much kind of more accurate way of doing this. Let's make a pretty small brush here, and let's make the hardness 100%, and just really kind of roughly make our opacity 100 so that it's just completely filling in. And we're just going to roughly fill in these whole areas. And then we're just going to carefully erase away the edge because that's a bit easier to do. So let's invert our color. So hit X on the keyboard and you can see that changes our color to black, or you could hit that little switch button there. Now let's make our brush nice and small like that. Let's raise the hardness down a little bit, not too much. We don't want it to be fully soft, but like 65% is probably good here. And then let's hold Alt and really zoom in. So we could start, you know, slowly brushing away here, and that would work. But one of the handiest tips you can do while using the brush tool is create straight lines. So if I were to click in one area, so I've clicked here, and then move to a different part, and then hold Shift and click again, it will draw a straight line for me between those 2 points, which is really handy. So we've got this straight line here. Let me just click at the very bottom. I'm just looking at the left side of my brush. Hold Shift and then click again. You can see it automatically will make a beautiful straight line between those 2 points. We can do the same thing again up here. I'm just manually clicking around this corner because it's pretty easy to do. So I'm going to align the bottom of my brush with the very top of where I'd want it to start. And then I'll scroll over to the other side. I'm going to hold the space bar so that the little hand appears, and then I can just click and drag across the image just to navigate. I'm going to hold shift and then click over on this side, and you can see it automatically will draw a wonderful straight line between those points. Let's just continue along. There's a little bright highlight here on this side, so our mask doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but you can get very, very accurate and nice masks with this method. And last one, let's click on the top edge there. Shift click and go over here. That looks great. And there we go. That should be a pretty clean mask. And now look at that. Look how nice that, that screen is. It's much brighter and more visible than before. Okay, now that we have our dodging and burning done, let's put those into a group. So let's select all three of those layers, right click on them, and then say group from layers. We can call that dodge/burn. There we go. Now we have all of our dodging and burning in a nice little folder. So it's nice and organized. Next, let's do some kind of color correction. There's two things that I'd like to do. One is I see that, these cups are looking a little bit kind of bluish and cold, especially compared to this cup down here. So let's warm up these cups. It's a real easy fix. Make sure you're selected on our base layer again, so that any layer does not go above our global edits. Then let's go to layer, new adjustment layer, and color balance. There we go. Let's call this warm cups. And then let's just make a very warm filter. So we're going to move toward the yellow and then move toward the red and maybe add a little bit of green. Should add a lot of warmth to there. It's okay that it's extreme because we're going to be, masking, and then we could change the opacity and settings afterwards. So there we go. We have a very warm overall layer. Let's invert our mask holding Control I. And then let's grab our brush, make sure it's white, and then also make sure our opacity is around 10%. Then let's make a pretty big brush, kind of like what we did before when we were darkening the highlights. Make sure the hardness is around 0%, and then we can just start slowly clicking and dragging some warmth into these cups. I think even something like this is more than enough. And remember, we can always go back later and adjust just those certain parts. So we could, add a little warmth to the shadows, may give us the effect that we want. We could even add, a little warmth or coldness to the highlights to really give the effect that we like. And there we go. We could also change the opacity there as well. So that looks pretty good to me. We've warmed up those cups just a little bit. Next, let's also try and adjust the color here of this metal. You can see how over on this side, we have this daylight coming in from a window, but then over here, we've got this kind of tungsten light. So let's see if we can't cool off these areas over here to try and color match with the daylight coming in through the window. So let's add a new adjustment layer that is color balance. Let's call this fix tungsten lights. So we're going to need to cool this off a fair bit. And this may be a situation where we're just going to have to adjust it a little bit later. I'm just going to try and get it pretty close. Okay, so this is a pretty extreme fix again, but it will help us to see where we are adding our mask. So let's invert, and then let's get a little smaller brush. It can still be 0 hardness and around 11% opacity. And let's see if we can't click in just a little bit of cooling light here. It does look a little bit green in the highlights, so I'm going to focus in on those highlights a little more. something like this. Let's see, we can even go to this edge up here. And then maybe let's do this edge over here. There we go. That's making it a lot cooler. We can even adjust into the buttons a little bit. Let's get this side. There we go. And I think the top of the lid is probably just fine. So that already is much better. But remember, we can also adjust it more. So I was noticing there was a little bit of green happening, so we could shift this just slightly magenta, maybe go into the highlights and try to get rid of a little of that green, maybe make them a little more blue. It's probably too much blue. So there you go. You can see we're just cooling off that whole edge where we had some uneven lighting color. All right, let's add these to a group. Oh, sorry, click on that side. Sorry if you can't see that option fully. Let's call this color fixing. So now we can just turn all that on and off, and we can turn all of our layers on and off. There's a couple more things I want to show. One is removing some dust or maybe some wires or something. We're going to get more into this with the portrait assignment. But let's say I wanted to remove some of the dust from this, this area here. We're going to select, it's right above the brush. It is the spot healing tool. So we click on that. It looks like a little band-aid with a circle inside. Let's make our brush size really small. The hardness staying in the middle is fine. And then we just kind of click and draw around these little areas of dust, and it will automatically get rid of those. For the most part, it tends to do a very good job. There are some times when it doesn't. So let's say we want to get rid of this little white kind of corner of the window here. We can just do that, and it should have no problems with that. Let's say we wanted to get rid of this little black line here. I'm imagining it's not going to have as good of a time. See, it's kind of messing up. There is ways to go in more manually with other tools like the clone stamp tool. And we're going to get into that a little bit more down the line. Next, another thing that we can do to our overall kind of background is we can add some sharpening. So let's create a copy of the background so that we are not, applying our filter to the one copy we have. I probably should have also made a copy before doing the dust removal. That would have been the safest thing to do. So let's go on to this very top copy. So now we can go up to filter and then sharpen and then unsharp mask. So an unsharp mask will add an amount of contrast to the whole image, but only in small sections that we define by the radius. So you see if I crank the radius up, it's adding contrast to all these areas. So it gets really, really extreme and bad. Generally, you're going to want to stay between like 0.5 and maybe 2 or 3 at the most. And you also are going to want to keep your amount probably down around between 90 and like 110%. It tends to be a good area. So just zoom in a little bit. If you click around, it'll actually give you this little preview here in the window of where you click. You could also just zoom in before you add the sharpness layer. But just by clicking around and looking at different areas, you can check that the radius is not too extreme. There's also a little preview checkbox that we can turn on and off just to see that our sharpness is giving an effect. Let's hit OK. So I'm pretty happy with where that is. And then, of course, we have the layer that we just sharpened, and we have the unsharpened layer behind it. So here you can see I'm adding, quite an amount of sharpness. It's a little bit much, but it's good for showing an example. You can lower the opacity of a sharpness layer, but it doesn't always, just reduce the effect. Sometimes you just need to start over from your unsharpened layer and just get rid of your sharpness layer if you did something too extreme, which is why you always want to copy your background layers. Okay, so that will just about do it. As a reminder, the first thing we did is we edited our background image in the camera raw filter. Then we did our global edits, so just our overall level, saturation, color balance, all that good stuff. Then underneath of that, we added our dodging and burning layers using the levels adjustment layers and coloring in our masks. Then we did the same thing, but with color in order to warm up our cups and cool off this edge here. And next, the only thing that's last is to save everything out. We did a little bit of sharpening on a fresh background layer and some dust removal. And now that we are all done and ready to export, let's go up to File, and then Scripts, Image Processor. Let's click Save as JPEG and Save as PSD. Make sure our JPEG quality is 12. And then we want to make sure we're using our open image and saving in the same location. These settings generally stay on all the time. And then we just have to make sure that we're doing a JPEG at quality 12 and saving a Photoshop file as well. So let's click Run. We only have one picture in here right now. But if we then go back to our folder, we can see that we now have these two folders for JPEG and Photoshop. And that is what you would turn into me, are both the JPEG and Photoshop files. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you later.